Welcome to Strategic Affairs. In the heart of London, where history and power collide, a storm began to gather around what should have been an ordinary building project. On the surface, it looked like just another redevelopment plan. A forgotten piece of land, a site once used for the Royal Mint, was waiting for a new purpose. But when China unveiled its vision for the area, London found itself staring at a project that many began to call the most dangerous building proposal the city had ever seen. This was no ordinary embassy plan. China's blueprint was for a massive complex, one that would become its largest diplomatic headquarters in Europe. More than just a few offices and a flagpole, the design showed sprawling buildings, multiple underground levels, fortified walls, and communication facilities that looked more like something built for secrecy than for ceremony. To Beijing, it was a bold symbol of power, a way to cement its presence in the heart of the United Kingdom. To many in London, however, it looked like a fortress, and perhaps even a spy hub in disguise. The controversy did not erupt all at once. At first, it was whispered about in political circles and among security experts. The location itself raised questions. The Royal Mint site sits near government buildings, financial institutions, and critical transport networks. It is not far from the beating heart of London's political machine. Placing such a huge foreign diplomatic complex there struck many as a security risk too great to ignore. Security agencies began to raise concerns. While embassies are technically sovereign territory under international law, they have always been viewed with suspicion during times of tension. In the Cold War, embassies on both sides doubled as listening posts, their walls hiding secret equipment, their rooms hosting covert meetings. The tools of espionage have changed, but the principle remains the same. Now the fear was no longer about bugs hidden in the walls, but about digital surveillance, hacking stations, and advanced communications being hidden beneath the cover of diplomacy. British intelligence officials reportedly briefed ministers, warning that the size and location of the embassy could allow Beijing to conduct operations that were impossible to monitor. The Royal Mint site, with its underground plans, could easily become a hub for cyber warfare, for the interception of wireless networks, or for gathering intelligence in ways invisible to the public. While these assessments were never made public, enough hints reached the press to ignite speculation. Suddenly, the project wasn't about bricks and mortar anymore. It was about spies, secrets, and the fear of what might go on behind closed doors. The political debate grew louder. Some ministers argued that Britain should treat the embassy as a diplomatic right, something every nation deserves. Blocking it, they said, would create a diplomatic crisis with China, one that could harm trade, investment, and cooperation on global issues. Others, however, saw it differently. They believed that allowing China to build such a fortress in the middle of London was like inviting danger into the capital. In their view, the risk of espionage, surveillance, and influence was far greater than any economic benefit outside of government. The project stirred up unrest in Tower Hamlets itself, the borough that would host the new embassy. Residents were already struggling with overcrowding, housing shortages, and strained public services. The idea of a huge embassy, with security checkpoints, constant protests, and police presence, was not welcomed. Locals feared their daily lives would be disrupted. Some said the land could be better used for affordable housing, schools, or community services. Instead, it was about to become the stage for global politics, bringing with it disruption and conflict. Then came the leaks. British newspapers began reporting on secret cables and internal memos that revealed divisions within the government. Some top officials feared that rejecting the project outright would anger Beijing to the point of retaliation. China could target British businesses, restrict exports, or make life harder for UK citizens in China. Others in government, however, saw no choice but to resist. They argued that Britain's security and sovereignty had to come first, no matter what the economic cost. As the story reached the headlines, the public became more engaged. Commentators on television called the project London's most dangerous building. Columnists wrote about how embassies were no longer just symbols of friendship but could be used as tools of influence and power. Protests outside the site grew larger. Residents carried signs warning of surveillance and demanding the land be used for public good. Police began increasing their presence, fearing clashes between protesters and those who supported the embassy plan. China, meanwhile, pushed back hard. Its diplomats in London dismissed all the suspicions as nothing more than political paranoia. They said the current embassy at Portland Place was outdated and too small, unable to handle the growing flow of visas and diplomatic functions. They insisted the new site was simply a practical solution, not a spy hub. In official statements, they warned that blocking the embassy would be seen as a sign of anti-China sentiment, something that could damage relations for years to come. Behind these statements, however, was a clear message. Beijing would not take rejection lightly. Britain depended on China for trade, for investment, and for cooperation in areas like climate change. Angering Beijing could have wide consequences. That knowledge weighed heavily on British officials as the debate continued. At the same time, the United States began quietly stepping in. American intelligence agencies had long warned their allies that Chinese diplomatic and commercial buildings could double as intelligence hubs. Washington shared assessments with London, urging it to take a harder line to the United States. Allowing such a fortress to be built in the heart of London would be nothing less than reckless. Britain, they argued, needed to stand firm, even if it meant provoking Beijing. This international dimension added even more pressure. Britain was caught between two powers. On one side, China, a crucial trading partner, was pushing for its project to move forward. On the other, the United States, its closest ally, was urging it to block the plan. The Royal Mint site was no longer a local issue, or even a national one. It had become a symbol of the global power struggle between East and West, played out on the streets of Tower Hamlets. As the weeks turned into months, the controversy grew deeper. Every new headline, every new protest, every new leak seemed to raise the stakes. The Royal Mint site, once just a forgotten corner of London, was now a battleground of secrecy, power, and diplomacy. What was meant to be a building project had become something far greater, a test of Britain's identity in a shifting world. The question was no longer whether China could build an embassy. The question was whether London could afford to let it. Was this project truly a diplomatic necessity, or was it a dangerous gamble, one that could hand Beijing the keys to the city's secrets? As the debate raged on, one thing became clear. This was not just about construction. It was about trust, fear, and the fragile balance of power in the modern world. The more the embassy project was discussed, the more secrets began to leak out. Behind closed doors, security agencies were preparing reports that painted a far darker picture than anything the public had yet seen. These reports suggested that the Royal Mint site could become one of the most powerful listening posts in Europe if Beijing went ahead with its plans. Advanced technology hidden inside the walls could allow China to intercept communications, track mobile signals, and even monitor the movement of individuals across London. To the ordinary citizen, it sounded like something out of a spy thriller, but for those who understood how modern intelligence worked, it was a chilling reality. Surveillance was no longer about planting bugs or tapping phones. It was about data, oceans of digital information flowing through invisible networks. Whoever could control and analyze that data could hold immense power. Placing a vast embassy right in the middle of London's most sensitive districts meant giving a foreign power an unparalleled opportunity to harvest that information. Inside Whitehall, the atmosphere grew tense. Cabinet ministers clashed behind the scenes. Some argued that rejecting the embassy would only push China further away, driving it into a more hostile posture. Britain, they said, could not afford another diplomatic enemy, especially at a time when it was still navigating the uncertain waters of Brexit and struggling to maintain its global influence. Others were blunt. They believed that allowing the project to proceed would amount to a catastrophic security blunder. They reminded their colleagues of the lessons of the Cold War, when embassies were often little more than fronts for espionage. The British press picked up on these divisions and ran with them. Newspapers splashed dramatic headlines across their front pages, with phrases like Spy Fortress and London's Trojan Horse. Some tabloids painted the embassy as nothing short of an invasion, a creeping occupation disguised as diplomacy. Even more measured outlets began to ask pointed questions about why Britain would take such a risk. At the same time, activists and local residents continued their protests. They weren't just worried about spies. They were angry that land which could have been used for schools, hospitals, or affordable housing was instead being handed to a foreign government. Tower Hamlets was one of the most deprived areas in London, and residents felt ignored. Now, their streets were filling with police, their lives were being disrupted by demonstrations, and they had no say in the decisions being made. To them, the embassy represented not just a security risk, but a symbol of neglect and inequality. The protests grew louder and more organized. Community groups held rallies outside the site. Human rights organizations joined in, pointing out China's record of repression and surveillance at home. They argued that building such a fortress in London was an insult to those who had fled China in search of freedom. Dissidents who had escaped persecution in Hong Kong and Xinjiang stood with banners, warning that the embassy could become a tool of intimidation against the Chinese diaspora in Britain. Their voices added a moral weight to the protests, transforming what had once been a local planning dispute into a national cause. The Metropolitan Police found themselves caught in the middle. Each new protest brought the risk of clashes, and every week the crowd grew larger. Officers were deployed in increasing numbers, stretching resources already under pressure. Police commanders warned that if the project went forward, the embassy would likely become a permanent flashpoint, requiring constant surveillance, security cordons, and crowd control. The cost of policing alone, they argued, could run into the millions. Meanwhile, whispers of espionage reached new heights. Former intelligence officials began appearing on television, giving cryptic warnings about the risks. They spoke of embassies as frontline stations of modern intelligence warfare. They explained how high-powered antennas, satellite dishes, and hidden communication systems could turn a building into a powerful surveillance hub. They did not give specifics. Classified information could not be revealed, but the tone of their warnings was clear. London was on the verge of inviting a spy fortress into its very heart. Across the Atlantic, the United States kept applying pressure. American officials, already engaged in a fierce rivalry with China, viewed the Royal Mint project as a test case. If London approved it, they feared other European capitals would follow suit, allowing Beijing to plant similar embassies across the continent. Washington urged Britain to think carefully, reminding its leaders of the special alliance known as the Five Eyes, which linked the UK with the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. If Britain allowed a potential spy hub to sit in the middle of its capital, would its allies still trust it with their most sensitive intelligence? This was the unspoken threat hanging over Britain. By approving the embassy, it risked weakening its most important alliance. And in intelligence work, trust was everything. Inside the British government, one phrase began to circulate: London's most dangerous building project. It was not just a tabloid label anymore. It was how officials were privately referring to the embassy. The name captured the sense of unease, the fear that this building was more than just concrete and glass. It was a symbol of how modern espionage and geopolitics had changed. Still, there were those who resisted this narrative. Business leaders argued that blocking the embassy would damage Britain's economy. They reminded ministers that China was one of the UK's largest trading partners, a source of investment, students, and tourism. They pointed to British universities filled with Chinese students, British companies dependent on Chinese factories, and British exports that relied on Chinese markets. Could Britain really afford to risk all of this for the sake of a building project? Chinese diplomats, too, pushed back with increasing frustration. They accused Britain of paranoia, of being manipulated by America's anti-China agenda. We said the new embassy was a necessity, not a weapon. They warned that if London blocked it, there would be serious consequences. The tone of their statements grew sharper, hinting at a diplomatic crisis waiting to explode. For ordinary Londoners, the situation became more confusing by the day. Some saw the protests and sympathized. Others rolled their eyes, dismissing the fears as exaggerated. A few wondered whether the entire controversy was being blown out of proportion by politicians seeking attention. But whether they cared or not, everyone knew about the project. It was impossible to ignore. The words Chinese embassy and Royal Mint had become daily fixtures on the news, sparking arguments in cafes, pubs, and on social media. The debate reached a turning point when an internal planning document leaked. The document included diagrams of the proposed embassy complex, showing its fortified design, with multiple barriers, checkpoints, and security zones. To many it looked less like an embassy and more like a military base. The leak confirmed what critics had been saying all along. This was not a normal diplomatic site. It was something far larger, far more imposing, and potentially far more dangerous. That the images of the design spread quickly online. They were shared on Twitter, dissected on YouTube, and debated on talk shows. Each new detail fed the narrative that London was about to host not just an embassy, but a fortress. The sense of unease deepened at this stage. Even those who had tried to stay neutral began to take sides. Opposition politicians demanded that the government block the project. They accused ministers of weakness, of being willing to sell out Britain's security for trade deals. On the other hand, business-friendly voices accused critics of hysteria, warning that Britain was heading toward economic isolation. The issue was no longer just about the Royal Mint site. It had become a symbol of Britain's place in the world, of how it would navigate the growing rivalry between China and the West. Would London side with its oldest ally, Washington, and block the project? Or would it take the risk, betting that engagement with Beijing was worth the danger? In Tower Hamlets, the protests reached their peak. Thousands gathered in the streets chanting, waving banners, and demanding that the project be scrapped. Local leaders called on the government to listen to their voices. They said the embassy would bring nothing but chaos to their borough. Them, the decision was simple. The people did not want it. As tensions mounted, it became clear that a decision was near. Britain could not delay forever. The embassy had become a lightning rod for all the fears and frustrations of a changing world. To approve it would be to embrace risk. To reject it would be to provoke a global superpower. Either way, the consequences would be profound. The stage was set for a showdown, and as the world watched, London prepared to decide the fate of its most dangerous building project. The uproar surrounding the embassy project reached a fever pitch inside Parliament. What had begun as whispers in security circles was now front-page news, debated in every political forum, splashed across every talk show, and dissected on countless editorials. The Royal Mint site was no longer just a patch of land in East London. It had become the center of a storm that tied together Britain's security, its foreign policy, its economy, and its identity in a changing world. In the House of Commons, members of Parliament stood one after another to voice their concerns. Some described the embassy as a fortress of espionage, a clear and present danger to Britain's sovereignty. Others, more cautious in their tone, warned that Britain, to risk sleepwalking into a confrontation with China that it could not win. Every debate was charged with emotion, and the divide was clear: security versus diplomacy, principle versus pragmatism. Cabinet ministers found themselves under relentless questioning. Was the government truly aware of the risks? Had they sought advice from intelligence agencies? Could conditions be imposed on the construction, limiting its size or restricting the technologies that could be installed inside? These questions demanded answers, but ministers gave little away. Their replies were vague, carefully crafted, designed to buy time. The official line remained the same: the application is under review, and national security considerations will be paramount. Behind the scenes, however, the pressure was immense. The intelligence services had already made their views clear. Their private briefings to ministers were stark. They warned that the Royal Mint site could give China a strategic vantage point, enabling not just passive surveillance but active cyber operations, hidden beneath the language of diplomacy. The message was blunt: approving the embassy was like opening the gates to a rival power. China, meanwhile, escalated its lobbying campaign. Its diplomats reminded Britain of the economic ties that bound the two nations together. Billions in trade, thousands of jobs, streams of investment, all of it, they suggested, could be jeopardized by what they saw as unfounded paranoia. They painted the embassy as a simple necessity, a functional building meant to replace an outdated facility. But the sharper their words became, the more they seemed to confirm the suspicions of critics. Human rights activists added fuel to the fire. They organized marches not only in Tower Hamlets but across Britain, drawing attention to China's actions in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. To them, the embassy represented more than just a local security concern. It was a symbol of a regime that sought to extend its influence beyond its borders, silencing critics wherever they lived. Protesters held banners that read, "No spy base in London" and "Human rights before profit." Their voices could not be ignored. At the same time, business groups warned of the cost of confrontation. Britain's fragile economy, still reeling from the twin shocks of Brexit and the pandemic, depended heavily on trade with China. From British car exports to Chinese markets, to Chinese students filling university halls, to investments flowing into London's financial center, the ties ran deep. To jeopardize them, business leaders argued, was reckless. They urged ministers to find a compromise, a middle ground that could preserve both security and prosperity in this clash of voices. The British public grew increasingly polarized. Polls revealed a sharp divide. Some believed the embassy must be blocked at all costs, while others felt Britain could not afford to risk its economy. Social media became a battleground of arguments and counter-arguments, with hashtags trending almost daily. To many, it felt less like a debate about a building and more like a referendum on Britain's relationship with the future itself. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Washington watched closely. American officials privately made their position clear. Britain could not approve the embassy without consequences. The United States, they reminded London, shared its deepest intelligence secrets with only a handful of trusted allies. If London allowed a potential Chinese spy hub to sit in its capital, it could strain, perhaps even break, that trust. For Britain, whose global influence increasingly relied on its intelligence-sharing role, this was a threat it could not ignore. The pressure cooker reached new intensity when a second set of leaked documents surfaced. These internal cables revealed that high-ranking officials within the government were themselves deeply divided. Some argued that blocking the embassy outright was too dangerous diplomatically, that it would provoke retaliation from Beijing in ways Britain could not predict. Others countered that approving it would amount to national self-sabotage. The fact that these divisions had now spilled into the public domain only deepened the sense of crisis. Tower Hamlets Council added another twist. After months of local opposition, it formally rejected the planning application, citing both community impact and security fears. For Beijing, this was a stunning setback. But for London, it was only the beginning of a larger fight. The decision could be appealed. The central government still had the power to override the council, and in the corridors of Westminster, the debate was raging louder than ever. The embassy project had become more than a planning dispute. It was now a test of Britain's ability to navigate a world defined by great power rivalry. The days of easy engagement, when Britain could court Chinese investment without worrying about the geopolitical consequences, were over. This project had forced a reckoning. Was London prepared to choose security over trade, sovereignty over diplomacy, trust with allies over economic ties with Beijing? As the stalemate dragged on, speculation ran wild. Some analysts predicted that Britain would quietly approve a scaled-down version of the embassy, with certain restrictions in place. Others believed the project was doomed, a casualty of the worsening relationship between London and Beijing. And then there were those who feared the worst, that whichever choice Britain made, it would pay a heavy price. For residents of Tower Hamlets, the politics mattered less than the reality on their streets. Protesters continued to gather. Police continued to patrol. Journalists continued to film. The Royal Mint site itself remained quiet, fenced off and empty, a stage waiting for its final act. But everyone knew that the decision, when it came, would echo far beyond East London. It would be heard in Washington, in Beijing, in Brussels, and in every capital where the balance between diplomacy and security was being tested. This was no longer just about an embassy. It was about the kind of world Britain wanted to live in, and the price it was willing to pay to protect it. The Royal Mint site still sits silent, fenced off, its fate undecided. But the debate it unleashed has already changed Britain. What began as a planning application has grown into a confrontation that forced London to examine its place in a dangerous new world. Inside the government, officials understood that no matter which path they chose, there would be consequences. To approve the embassy meant living with suspicion. A constant fear that somewhere behind its walls, intelligence was being gathered, networks were being hacked, and secrets were being stolen. To block it meant facing the anger of Beijing, a global power not shy about retaliation. Britain's leaders were caught between two storms, and every day the pressure grew heavier. China, for its part, showed no signs of backing down. Its officials called the opposition insulting, unfair, and driven by anti-China sentiment. They insisted that the embassy was a symbol of respect, nothing more. But their tone grew sharper as delays dragged on. State media in Beijing accused Britain of hostility, of bending to American pressure, of betraying its own independence. Behind those words was a threat that if Britain rejected the embassy, it would pay a price. The price could come in many forms. Economic retaliation was the most obvious. China could cut investment, restrict imports, or target British companies operating in its markets. It could make life harder for British universities that relied on Chinese students, or for industries that depended on Chinese supply chains. The ripple effects could spread across the economy, from finance to manufacturing, from tourism to technology. For a Britain already struggling with uncertainty, the threat was serious. But the security warnings were just as serious. Intelligence experts stressed that this was not paranoia. It was a reality of modern geopolitics. Embassies had always been more than diplomatic buildings. They were hubs of influence, places where official diplomacy and covert intelligence blurred. In the age of cyber warfare, those roles had only expanded. A vast embassy in the middle of London, equipped with communications systems, could become a fortress of data gathering. Even if every cable was hidden, every antenna disguised, the risk would always remain. This was the heart of the dilemma. Britain could not have both. It could not guarantee absolute security while also granting China the symbol of power it demanded. Something had to give. As weeks turned into months, the story refused to fade. Journalists kept digging. More details of the embassy design emerged: underground levels, fortified barriers, hidden chambers. To some, these were normal features of a diplomatic compound. To others, they were proof of something darker. Headlines spoke of London's spy fortress and the embassy Britain fears. Every new revelation pulled the story deeper into the national imagination. The people of Tower Hamlets carried on with their daily lives, but the controversy remained on their doorstep. Local residents spoke of feeling trapped between giants. They worried about protests turning violent, about constant police checkpoints, about being overshadowed by a global dispute they had never asked to be part of. For them, the embassy was not just a question of geopolitics. It was a question of home, community, and the right to live in peace. Beyond Britain, the world was watching. European capitals studied the debate closely. Some governments sympathized with Britain's concerns, wary of allowing China too much influence in their own cities. Others shook their heads, seeing it as another example of London's political chaos. But no one ignored it. The Royal Mint controversy had become a case study in how global rivalry seeped into local politics, how great power competition could turn bricks and mortar into a battlefield. For Washington, the embassy saga was a vindication of its warnings. American officials continued to press their British counterparts, urging them to stand firm. They framed the decision as a test of the Western alliance. If London allowed the project to go ahead, it would signal weakness. If it blocked it, it would send a message to Beijing that the West was united. Britain, caught between its biggest economic partner and its oldest ally, struggled to balance the scales. Eventually, the Council's rejection of the planning application gave ministers temporary breathing space. But everyone knew the fight was not over. China had the right to appeal, and the central government still had the authority to intervene. The uncertainty dragged on, and with it, the sense of unease. The Royal Mint site became a symbol, a silent, empty stage representing a much larger drama. Some analysts argued that the embassy controversy was just the beginning. It revealed how far Britain's relationship with China had shifted. Gone were the days when investment deals and trade missions could smooth over disagreements. Now, every engagement carried suspicion. Every handshake was weighed against national security. The embassy had exposed the fault lines of a new era, one where mistrust was the default and where even a building project could trigger an international crisis. For China, the lesson was equally stark. Its global ambitions, once pursued through soft power and economic outreach, now met resistance at every turn. In Britain, in Europe, in the United States, doors were closing. What Beijing saw as legitimate expansion, others saw as encroachment, and the embassy, its grand symbol of presence, had turned into a lightning rod for opposition. In the end, the Royal Mint site remained untouched, its future uncertain. Whether it would one day rise into a towering embassy or remain an abandoned promise, no one could say, but the damage was already done. The debate had hardened attitudes, deepened divisions, and set the stage for future confrontations. For Britain, the embassy was a mirror. It forced the nation to confront its vulnerabilities, its dependencies, and its place in a world where power was shifting eastward. It revealed the limits of diplomacy in an age of rivalry, and the costs of security in a time of economic fragility. For China, it was a reminder that global ambitions come with resistance, and that symbols of power can also become symbols of fear. And for the people of Tower Hamlets, it was a lesson that local lives can be swept up in global struggles, that the world's battles are not fought only in distant capitals but also on ordinary streets, in ordinary neighborhoods. The story of London's most dangerous building project is not finished. It may take years to know its outcome, but already it has shown how deeply the world has changed. No longer are embassies just places of diplomacy. They are fortresses, lightning rods, battlegrounds. They are the places where nations test each other, where trust is measured, where fear is revealed. This is why the Royal Mint site matters. It is not just about London, not just about Britain, not even just about China. It is about the future of geopolitics itself, and that is why, when history looks back, it may well see this project not as an embassy, but as a warning.